There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday afternoon or the quiet hum of a refrigerator in a sleeping house. They do not announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They are silent currents that shift the very bedrock of your world without you even realizing the ground has moved. For me, that moment was the subtle, almost imperceptible brush of a thumb against my knuckles. It was a gesture so small it could have been an accident, a phantom limb of a thought made real for only a second. But it was not an accident. It was the quiet turning of a key in a lock I had long since forgotten was even there, opening a door into a room I had been terrified to enter for nearly a decade. It happened on the porch. That feels significant, somehow. The porch was a space that was neither inside nor out, a liminal threshold between the curated safety of my small house and the vast, unpredictable world beyond the screen door. We were sitting on the old wooden steps, the paint peeling under our weight in flakes of pale gray and forgotten white. It was late August, and the air was thick with the scent of coming rain and the sweet decay of summer's end. A single, bare bulb above the door cast a jaundiced, moth-battered glow over us, turning Julian's skin to warm honey and deepening the shadows under his eyes. He had been quiet for a long time, which was unusual for him. Julian's default state was a kind of gentle, kinetic energy. He was a person who filled spaces with easy laughter and rambling stories. His silence was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that had settled over the humid air between us. He was talking about nothing, really. About a project at work that was going nowhere, about the way the cicadas seemed louder this year. His voice was low, frayed at the edges like old rope. I was just listening, my role as it had always been. I was the anchor, the quiet shoreline to his restless tide. My camera, my constant companion, sat on the step beside me, its lens capped. For once, I had no desire to frame the moment, to capture the weary slump of his shoulders or the way the weak light caught the silver in the faint stubble on his jaw. I just wanted to exist in it, to let the stillness be enough. He had been staying with me for 3 months, a temporary arrangement that had stretched and softened into something that felt dangerously permanent. His life was in boxes in my spare room, a monument to a future he'd had to dismantle. My life, once a quiet, ordered space, now had his chaos bleeding into its corners. His running shoes by the door, his mug in the sink, the scent of his soap lingering in the bathroom long after his morning shower. He had his hand resting on the step between us, palm down, fingers splayed. It was a habit of his, a way of grounding himself. I knew the cartography of that hand better than I knew my own. I knew the raised scar on his index finger from a fishing accident when we were 20, the slight crookedness of his pinky from a badly set break in high school. My own hand was nearby, resting on my knee. We sat like that for minutes that felt like hours, caught in the amber of the porch light, the symphony of crickets the only sound. And then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He lifted his hand from the step and placed it over mine. It wasn't a grab or even a hold. It was a settling, a coming to rest. The weight of it was both a comfort and a terror. I felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth that seemed to sink directly into my bones. My heart began a frantic, silent drumming against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I told myself it was nothing. It was just Julian. He was tired, he was lost, and I was his friend. This was what friends did. They offered silent, physical comfort when words failed. But then came the current. He didn't squeeze my hand. He didn't lace his fingers with mine. He just rested his hand there, a silent acknowledgement of the space we shared. And after another long, breathless moment, he moved his thumb. It was the smallest of movements, a slow, circular stroke across the back of my hand, tracing the line of my knuckles. Once, twice. The touch was feather-light, but it landed on my skin like a brand. Every nerve ending in my body went quiet, listening. The entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. The sound of the cicadas, the smell of the rain, the sticky humidity of the air, it all receded, becoming a distant hum. There was only the rasp of his skin against mine and the catastrophic, thundering silence of everything I had never said. In that tiny, repeated gesture, a decade of carefully constructed walls, of meticulously managed feelings, crumbled into dust. It was a question asked without words, and I knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that my answer would change everything. We were just two friends, sitting on a porch. Until we were not. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. You have to go back 10 years, to a cramped college dorm room that always smelled faintly of stale pizza and drying paint. I met Julian because of a clerical error. I was supposed to be rooming with a quiet art history major. He was supposed to be with another guy from the soccer team. Instead, fate, or a profoundly bored housing administrator, threw the quiet observer and the unknowing initiator into a 12 by 15-foot box and waited to see what would happen. On that first day, he exploded into the room like a supernova. He was all bright, easy smiles and boundless energy, his duffel bags and boxes dumped in a chaotic pile in the center of the floor, while he immediately set about introducing himself to everyone on our hall. I was on my side of the room, methodically unpacking my books, arranging my desk, trying to carve out a small pocket of order in the overwhelming chaos of freshman move-in day. He finally turned his attention to me, his smile not dimming in the slightest in the face of my reserved silence. "You must be Leo," he'd said, extending a hand. "I'm Julian. Looks like we're cellmates." His grip was firm, warm, and brief. I remember thinking that he seemed like a force of nature, a weather system I would have to learn to navigate. I was quiet, introverted, more comfortable behind the lens of my camera than in the middle of a conversation. I saw the world in frames, in compositions of light and shadow. Julian saw the world as a place to be lived in, loudly and with gusto. We were a study in contrasts, an unlikely pairing that, by all logic, should have resulted in a year of polite, awkward silence and a swift roommate change request. But that isn't what happened. Instead, an odd symbiosis began to form. My quiet nature seemed to ground him. He would come crashing back into the room after a late practice or a party, buzzing with adrenaline and stories, and he would talk, not necessarily to me, but at the space I occupied. He'd pace the small strip of carpet between our beds, recounting plays from his game or conversations he'd had, and I would just listen, offering a nod or a quiet question. I became the repository for his thoughts, the silent witness to his life. In return, he pulled me, gently but persistently, out of my shell. He never pushed me to be someone I was not. He didn't drag me to massive parties or force me into loud social situations. Instead, he would knock on the darkroom door with takeout, claiming he was rescuing me from the chemical fumes. He'd convince me to come on late-night walks across campus. Just the two of us, pointing out constellations he barely knew and talking about his fears for an upcoming exam. He made space for my silence. He treated it not as an absence, but as a language of its own, one he was willing to learn. It was during one of those late-night walks in the spring of our freshman year that I knew I was in trouble. We were crossing the main quad, the old brick buildings of the university bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. It had just rained, and the air was clean and cool, the smell of wet earth rising from the lawns. Julian was laughing about something one of our professors had said, and he threw his head back, his throat exposed to the night. The light caught in the damp strands of his dark hair, and for a moment he looked like something sculpted, a piece of art I desperately wanted to capture. But it was more than an aesthetic appreciation. It was a sudden, sharp ache in my chest, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar it stole my breath. It was the dizzying realization that the fondness I had for him, the deep comfort I took in his presence, had quietly, without my permission, morphed into something else. Something deeper and far more dangerous. I fell in love with him the way you fall asleep, slowly, and then all at once. After that night, everything sharpened into a painful, beautiful focus. I became a scholar of Julian. I learned the subtle tells of his moods, the way he'd drum his fingers on a tabletop when he was anxious, the slight downward tilt of his lips when he was trying to hide his disappointment, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners a split second before he genuinely smiled. I noticed the way he'd push his hair back from his forehead when he was concentrating, the way he would chew on the inside of his cheek when he was thinking. These were tiny details, the footnotes of a person that most people would overlook. For me, they were a lexicon. They were the language of the person I loved, and I was fluent. Of course, I said nothing. To say something would have been to risk the entire, delicate ecosystem of our friendship. It was the most important relationship in my life, a steady, reliable warmth in a world that often felt cold and distant. To confess my feelings felt like holding a lit match to the only home I'd ever really known. So I buried it. I packed the feelings down, deep into a part of myself I rarely visited. I built walls around it, fortified with logic and self-preservation. He was my friend. He was straight. I was the quiet, artistic roommate, a fixture in his life as comfortable and unremarkable as his favorite old sweatshirt. And that had to be enough. I channeled my feelings into my art. He became my unwitting muse. I have hundreds of photos of him from those years, most of them taken when he was not looking. Julian asleep with a textbook on his chest, a line of drool on the page. Julian mid-laugh, his face a beautiful mess of unrestrained joy. Julian staring out the window of our apartment, lost in thought, the morning light tracing the strong line of his jaw. I told myself it was for a project, a study of candid portraiture. It was a lie, of course. It was an act of worship. It was the only way I could safely express the love that was humming just beneath my skin. After college, we got an apartment together. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world. He got a job as a software consultant, a career that required him to be charming and energetic, a perfect fit. I started to build a freelance photography business, working odd jobs and slowly making a name for myself. Our lives fell into a comfortable rhythm. He would travel for work, and the apartment would feel cavernously empty, the silence no longer peaceful but hollow. Then he would return, and the space would come alive again, filled with his presence, his stories, his laundry. It was during these years that he started dating Sarah. She was nice enough, a lawyer, smart and ambitious and beautiful. And she was, in every way, perfect for him. They made a handsome couple, the kind of people who look like they belong on the cover of a magazine. I learned to live with the particular kind of ache that came with seeing them together. I became an expert in the art of polite smiles and feigned enthusiasm. I hosted them for dinner, listened to Julian talk about their future plans, and helped him pick out a birthday present for her. Each act was a small paper cut on my soul, a tiny, stinging reminder of the chasm between what I wanted and what I could have. I built my fortress higher. I became the supportive best friend, the permanent third wheel. I convinced myself that my happiness was secondary to his. As long as he was happy, I could endure the quiet hum of my own loneliness. It was a fragile peace, a carefully negotiated treaty with my own heart, but for 5 years, it held. I created a life for myself within the boundaries I had set. I had my work, a small circle of friends, the quiet solitude of my darkroom. I had Julian's friendship, a constant, unwavering presence that was both my greatest joy and my deepest sorrow. I learned to live in the space between, in the quiet longing that had become the background radiation of my existence. I thought that was how it would always be. I had accepted it. And then, Sarah left him. The shift began with a phone call. It was just after midnight on a Wednesday. I was in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an eerie, monastic glow over the developing trays. The smell of fixer was sharp in the air. My phone, which I usually left outside, buzzed on a shelf, the vibration rattling against a stack of photo paper boxes. It was Julian. His name on the screen sent a familiar, low-level jolt of anxiety through me. He never called this late unless something was wrong. I answered, and the first thing I heard was not his voice, but the sound of a hollow, empty room. Leo. His voice was a wreck. It was thin and ragged, stripped of all its usual warmth and confidence. It sounded like it had been scraped raw. Julian? What's wrong? Where are you? I was already wiping my hands, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. She's gone, he said, and the 2 words were so full of a stunned, hollow disbelief that it felt like a physical blow. I came home, and she was gone. Her stuff is gone. There's a note. He didn't need to say who she was. I could hear him breathing on the other end, a series of short, sharp inhales, the sound of a man trying desperately not to fall apart. My own carefully constructed walls, the ones that kept my feelings for him contained, began to tremble. In that moment, he wasn't my impossible love. He was my best friend, and he was hurting. That was the only thing that mattered. "Stay right there," I said, my voice more steady than I felt. "Don't do anything. I'm coming over." I didn't wait for a reply. I hung up, switched off the safe light, and moved through my apartment on autopilot. I pulled on a pair of jeans and a sweatshirt, grabbed my keys, and was out the door in less than 3 minutes. The drive to the apartment he had shared with Sarah was a blur of streetlights and a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I had been there a dozen times for dinners and game nights, each visit a masterclass in self-inflicted emotional pain. I had watched him build a life in that space, a life that did not include me in the way I secretly yearned for. Now, that life had been detonated. When I let myself in with the spare key he'd given me years ago, the scene was even worse than I had imagined. The apartment was a ghost of its former self. There were pale rectangles on the walls where pictures used to hang, empty spaces on bookshelves that had once been crowded. It was a space defined by absences. And in the middle of the living room stood Julian, looking small and utterly lost. He was still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, his suit jacket slung over a chair. He was holding a single piece of stationery in his hand, the note, I presumed. He looked up when I came in, and his eyes were shattered. It was the kind of raw, undisguised pain I had only ever seen once before, when his father passed away in our junior year. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and his composure finally broke. A terrible, silent sob shook his entire body. I crossed the room and pulled him into a hug. He collapsed against me, his head burying into my shoulder, and he just wept. I held him, my hand on the back of his head, feeling the tremors that ran through him. I stood there in the wreckage of his life, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the faint, metallic smell of his tears, and I just held on. There were no words. What could I possibly say? All I could offer was my presence, the solid, unwavering fact of me. I was his anchor, and the tide had just gone out, leaving him stranded. We stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, the sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He pulled away, wiping his face with the back of his hand, his expression a mixture of devastation and embarrassment. "Sorry," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Don't be," I said softly. "Come on. You can't stay here tonight." I looked around the hollowed-out apartment. Every empty space was a fresh wound. "Pack a bag. Just for a few days. You're staying with me." He didn't argue. He just nodded, a slow, numb gesture. He moved like a sleepwalker, pulling a duffel bag from the closet and stuffing a few random articles of clothing into it. I waited by the door, giving him space, my heart a heavy, aching stone in my chest. It was a strange and terrible kind of wish fulfillment. For years, I had dreamed of him needing me, of him turning to me. But not like this. Never like this. As he zipped up the bag and walked towards me, leaving the note on the kitchen counter, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The carefully balanced dynamic of our friendship, the unspoken rules that had governed our interactions for a decade, had just been irrevocably broken. He was coming home with me, not as a guest, but as a refugee. And I, the quiet observer, was about to become his sanctuary. The thought was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. The first few days were a blur of quiet grief. Julian existed in my apartment like a ghost, moving through the rooms without really seeing them. He slept on the couch, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets, often for 12 or 13 hours at a time. When he was awake, he was either silent, staring at the television without registering what was on, or he was on the phone, having a series of clipped, painful conversations with his family and hers. I moved around him, a quiet satellite in his orbit of misery. I made coffee in the morning and just left a mug on the table for him. I cooked simple meals he barely touched. I didn't push him to talk. I just existed in the space with him, a constant, low-humming presence. I learned, in those first few days, that grief has its own architecture. It builds invisible walls, creates strange, echoing acoustics in familiar rooms. My small, comfortable apartment, once my sanctuary, had become a sick bay, a place of convalescence. The first time the new ritual began, it was almost by accident. It was about a week after he'd arrived. I had woken up around 3 in the morning to a sound from the living room. It was a small, choked noise, the sound of someone trying to cry without making a sound. I got out of bed and padded softly down the short hallway. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could see him on the couch. He was sitting up, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The sight of him so completely undone was a physical pain. My instinct was to retreat, to give him his privacy, but a stronger, more primal instinct took over, the need to comfort him. I walked over and sat on the edge of the coffee table in front of him. He looked up, his face pale and tear-streaked in the gloom. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't?" I lied. "I was just getting some water. I didn't know what to do." I wanted to reach out, to touch his shoulder, to offer some physical reassurance, but the space between us felt charged, fraught with a new and unfamiliar tension. For a decade, our physical interactions had been limited to brief, friendly hugs or the occasional celebratory backslap. This felt different. This was a deeper, more vulnerable territory. He solved the dilemma for me. He scrubbed at his eyes with the heels of his hands and let out a long, shuddering sigh. "I keep having these nightmares. I fall asleep, and I think it's okay, and then I dream that I'm back in the apartment, and she's there, and she's just packing." Over and over again, my heart broke for him. "Julian," I started, but I had no idea how to finish the sentence. There were no platitudes that could fix this. So I just sat there, a silent witness to his pain. We sat in the dark for a few minutes, the only sound his ragged breathing. Then, he said something that hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken need. "The couch is really lonely." It wasn't a complaint. It was a confession. It was a quiet, desperate admission of his own desolation. And without thinking, without allowing my over-analytical brain to catalog the risks and implications, I heard myself say, "My bed's big enough for two." The words were out before I could stop them. They felt reckless and monumental. As soon as I said them, a wave of panic washed over me. I had crossed a line. I was offering something that could be so easily misinterpreted, something that could shatter the fragile trust between us. I started to backpedal, to explain it away. "I mean, if you want. It's just, you might sleep better. It's nothing weird. Just there's space." I was rambling, my cheeks hot with a flush I was grateful he couldn't see in the dark. He was quiet for a long moment, and I was certain I had made a terrible mistake. I had taken his vulnerability and made it about my own hidden desires. But then he just nodded, a slow, tired movement. "Okay," he whispered. The word was so small, but it felt like a tectonic plate shifting beneath me. He stood up from the couch, pulling the blanket he'd been using around his shoulders like a shroud. He followed me back to my bedroom. The room felt different with him in it. It was my most private space, and suddenly he was standing in the middle of it, looking impossibly fragile. I got into my side of the bed, the side by the wall, and pulled the covers up, my body rigid with a mixture of terror and a wild, forbidden hope. He walked around to the other side and slid under the covers. The bed, which had always felt spacious, suddenly felt incredibly small. He lay on his back, and I lay on mine, a foot of space between us that felt like a mile-wide canyon. The silence was deafening. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart. I was acutely aware of every tiny detail. The scent of him, clean and familiar, the sound of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body across the small gap. I lay there, perfectly still, for what felt like an eternity, terrified to move, terrified to even breathe too loudly. I was convinced this was a one-time mistake, a moment of weakness for him and a moment of foolishness for me that we would both pretend never happened in the morning. But then, after about 10 minutes of this taut silence, he shifted. He rolled onto his side, facing away from me. The movement caused the blanket to pull slightly, and his back brushed against my arm. The contact was electric. It was like a jolt of lightning, brief and overwhelming. I flinched, pulling my arm back instinctively. He must have felt it, because he went still. Sorry, he mumbled into his pillow. It's okay, I whispered back to the dark. I slowly, carefully, let my arm relax, let it rest back where it had been. This time, I didn't pull away when our skin touched again. We lay like that, his back a warm, solid line against my arm, for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a single minute. I just lay there, listening to his breathing as it slowly deepened and evened out into the rhythm of sleep. He was asleep. He was safe. And he was here, in my bed. It was the most exquisitely painful and beautiful night of my life. I was his harbor, his safe port in a storm, and I knew, with a sinking feeling, that I would let him shipwreck me if he asked. That night established the new normal. It was the beginning of the ritual. The next night, he didn't even go to the couch. After we'd quietly watched a movie, he just stood up and said, "I think I'm going to turn in," and walked into my bedroom. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. It was simply what was happening now. An unspoken agreement had been forged in the 3 a.m. darkness. My bed was his refuge. And so it began. Every night, we would go through the same quiet routine. We would end our day, he would go to my room, and I would follow a few minutes later. We never spoke about it. In the bright light of day, we fell back into our old roles. We were just friends. We'd talk about work, about the logistics of him finding a new place, about anything and everything except the fact that we were sharing a bed every night. It was a secret we kept from each other, a silent conspiracy of comfort. The space between us and the bed began to shrink. It happened incrementally, a slow erosion of boundaries so gradual I could almost convince myself it was not happening. The first week, we slept on our respective sides, backs to each other. Then, one night, I woke up to find he had rolled over in his sleep, and one of his arms was thrown across my waist. My entire body went rigid. His hand was resting on my hip, his fingers lax in sleep. His face was buried in the space between my shoulder blades, and I could feel his warm breath on my back. I lay there, trapped by the weight of his arm, my mind a screaming chaos of panic and longing. I should move. I should gently disengage his arm and roll away. It was the sensible thing to do, the self-preservationist thing to do. But I could not. I just lay there, soaking in the illicit warmth of his body against mine, until the sun began to filter through the blinds. He woke up before me, and I felt him stir, his arm tightening for a second before he seemed to realize where it was. He pulled it back quickly, and when I finally dared to turn over, he was already sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, pulling on a shirt. Neither of us mentioned it, but the line had been crossed. After that night, the pretense of accidental contact began to fade. He would fall asleep facing me, his forehead sometimes brushing against mine. I learned the exact rhythm of his sleeping breath, the way it would catch in his throat in a soft snore just before he fell into a deep sleep. I learned that he kicked in his sleep when he was stressed, and that he sometimes mumbled things too garbled to understand. I became an archivist of his unconscious self. My bedroom, my bed, was no longer just my own. It had become a shared territory, a space governed by a new, unspoken set of rules. The door to the room, which I had always slept with closed, was now left slightly ajar. It was a symbolic gesture, I suppose. A tacit acknowledgement that this arrangement was temporary, that the space was not entirely sealed off. It was a potential escape route, a sliver of deniability in a situation that was becoming increasingly undeniable. My internal world during this period was a raging storm. During the day, I was calm, steady Leo, the reliable friend. But at night, lying next to him in the dark, I was a wreck. Every night was a tightrope walk over a canyon of my own feelings. I was terrified of doing something wrong, of making a move that would shatter the fragile trust he had placed in me. The proximity was a constant, low-grade torture. To be so close to the one thing I wanted most in the world, to be able to smell his skin and feel his warmth, and to know that it was all offered under the guise of platonic comfort, was excruciating. I felt like a fraud. I was taking his pain and his trust, and secretly feeding my own desperate love with it. The guilt was a heavy weight in my chest. But the thought of telling him to go back to the couch, of ending this strange, intimate ritual, was even more unbearable. I was selfish. I wanted him there, even if it was destroying me. I would lie awake for hours, charting the constellations of freckles on his back, my hand aching with the need to reach out and trace them. I would clench my fists under the covers, my nails digging into my palms, just to keep from touching him. This went on for months. Summer bled into fall. The green leaves outside my window turned to gold and then to rust. Julian started to heal. The raw, open wound of his breakup began to scar over. The hollow look in his eyes was replaced with his old light. He started laughing again, genuine, full-throated laughs that made my heart ache. He started talking about the future, about getting his own place, about moving on. And with every sign of his recovery, a new kind of dread began to build in me. The ritual had been born of his need, his crisis. As his need receded, what would happen to us? Would he just move out one day, and our nights of shared silence and accidental intimacy would become just a strange footnote in the story of our friendship? The thought of going back to sleeping alone in that bed, of the apartment falling back into its old, quiet emptiness, was a prospect I could not bear to face. The sanctuary I had built for him had become my own beautiful, heartbreaking prison. I was caught in a loop of hope and fear, and I had no idea how to escape. He was getting better, and I was falling apart. The crossing point, when it finally came, was not in the darkness of my bedroom, but back on the porch, where this reflection began. It was a cool evening in late August, almost exactly 3 months after he had first shown up at my door. The air was thick and heavy, promising a thunderstorm that had been threatening all day. We had just finished dinner, and we'd migrated outside to the front steps, a habit we'd fallen into. It was our space for quiet talks, for unwinding the day. Julian had been looking at apartment listings online earlier, and the reality of his impending departure felt more concrete than ever. A quiet melancholy had settled over me, a preemptive grief for the closeness I was about to lose. He was talking, but I was not really listening to the words. I was listening to the music of his voice, trying to memorize its cadence. I was watching the way he gestured with his hands, trying to burn the image into my memory. He was talking about a 2-bedroom place over on the north side of town. "It's got good light," he said. "You'd like it. For your photos," he said it so casually, as if my opinion on the light in his future, separate life was just a simple, friendly inquiry. To me, it felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin. The coffin of this strange, liminal space we had been inhabiting. My own anxiety must have been radiating off me in waves, because his voice trailed off. He looked at me, really looked at me, a deep, searching gaze that I felt in the pit of my stomach. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "You've been quiet all night." I could have lied. I could have manufactured a complaint about work or a headache. It would have been the easy thing to do, the safe thing. But I was so tired. I was tired of the silence, tired of the pretense, tired of the constant, aching weight of everything I could not say. So I just shook my head, a small, barely perceptible movement. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Not really," he didn't press. He just watched me, his expression unreadable in the dim porch light. And that was when he moved his hand, placing it over mine where it rested on my knee. The gesture was no longer accidental or born of a desperate need for comfort. It felt intentional. It felt like an anchor being dropped in a churning sea. My breath hitched. We sat in that charged silence for a long time, his hand a warm, heavy weight on mine. The world seemed to slow down. And then, he brushed his thumb across my knuckles. Once, twice, the same gesture that had started this whole reflection. But this time, I understood its context. It wasn't the beginning. It was the culmination. It was the final, quiet question after months of unspoken answers. He was still looking at me, his eyes searching mine in the gloom. "Leo," he said, and my name was a fragile thing in the humid air. He swallowed, and I saw his throat move. "What are we doing?" The question was the one I had been both dreading and praying for. It was the match being struck in a room full of dynamite. And I knew, with absolute clarity, that I could not lie. Not anymore. "I don't know, Julian," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "All I know is that I don't want it to stop." It was the most honest thing I had said to him in 10 years. It was a confession, a plea, and a terrified declaration all at once. The admission hung in the air between us, vulnerable and terrifying. I watched a dozen emotions flicker across his face: confusion, fear, and then something else. Something that looked like relief. He took a breath, a deep, shuddering inhale, and his thumb stroked my knuckles again, a slow, reassuring rhythm. "Me neither," he whispered. And then he leaned in. It was a slow, tentative movement, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop it, to retreat back into the safety of our friendship. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the question he was asking without words. I didn't pull away. I held my breath and met him halfway. His lips were soft, hesitant, and the kiss was not one of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a discovery. It was the taste of rain and salt and 3 months of unspoken, unbearable tension finally being released. It lasted only a few seconds, but it redrew the map of my entire world. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed, the storm that had been threatening all day finally breaking inside of us. "Okay," he breathed out, a single word that felt like an answer to a lifetime of questions. "Okay." The aftermath was not the explosion of clarity I had hoped for. Instead, it was a period of profound and terrifying confusion, a disorienting silence after the storm. The morning after the kiss on the porch was steeped in a thick, unbearable awkwardness. We woke up in my bed as we had for months, but the space between us was no longer a zone of comfortable ambiguity. It was a crater, a blast site. I was intensely aware of him, of his breathing, of the warmth of his skin. He seemed to be just as aware of me. He lay on his side, facing away, his body held in a tense, rigid line. The easy intimacy of the past few months had evaporated, replaced by the self-consciousness of two people who had stumbled across a line and did not know how to get back, or if they even wanted to. He got out of bed first, without a word. I listened to his movements in the apartment, the click of the bathroom door, the rush of the shower, the opening and closing of cupboards in the kitchen. Each sound was amplified in the tense silence. When I finally emerged from the bedroom, he was standing by the counter, dressed and holding a mug of coffee, staring out the window. He looked like a stranger in my kitchen. I tried to act normal, to fall back on our established morning routine. "Coffee?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. He turned, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. He just nodded, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "Made a pot," he mumbled. The air was thick with everything that had happened and everything that was not being said. The kiss had been a confession, a moment of pure, unadulterated honesty. But in the harsh light of morning, it seemed that fear had rushed in to fill the void that honesty had created. I poured myself a mug, my hands shaking slightly. We stood in the kitchen, on opposite sides of the room, drinking our coffee in a silence that was more profound and lonelier than any silence we had ever shared before. Then he shattered it. "I should go," he said, placing his mug in the sink with a clatter. "I have an early meeting. A lot to prep for." It was a lie, and we both knew it. His calendar was on the fridge, and it was empty for the morning. It was a flimsy, transparent excuse, a desperate flight from the complexity of what we had done. Before I could even formulate a response, he was grabbing his laptop bag and his keys. He paused at the door, his back still to me. I'll probably stay at a hotel tonight, closer to the office, just to make things easier." Each word was a physical blow. A hotel. After 3 months of sleeping in my bed, he was retreating to the sterile anonymity of a hotel. It was a rejection so clear, so total, that it stole the air from my lungs. He was running. He was not just running from me. He was running from what had happened between us. He left without another word, the click of the front door echoing in the suddenly cavernous apartment. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, my coffee growing cold in my hands, and I felt a despair so deep it was almost paralyzing. I had misinterpreted everything. The shared bed, the quiet intimacy, the kiss. I had painted it with the colors of my own desire, and I had been wrong. I wasn't his sanctuary. I was just a convenience, a warm body in a storm. And now that the storm was passing, he was moving on, leaving me in the wreckage. The pain of it was a physical thing, a hollow ache in the center of my chest that made it hard to breathe. For the next 3 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. He didn't come back. A single, terse text message arrived the first evening. Just swamped at work. We'll grab the rest of my stuff this weekend. It was impersonal, dismissive. It was the kind of text you send to an acquaintance, not the person whose bed you have been sharing for a season. I didn't reply. What could I say? I replayed the kiss on the porch over and over in my mind, analyzing it like one of my own photographs, searching for a flaw in the composition, a detail I had missed. Had I imagined the relief in his eyes? Had I invented the tenderness in his touch? My mind became a torture chamber of self-doubt and recrimination. I had been a fool. I had risked the most important friendship of my life for a moment of impossible hope, and I had lost everything. The apartment was unbearable. Every corner of it held a ghost of him. His scent lingered on the pillows. His favorite mug sat alone in the dish drainer. The spare room, filled with the boxes of his dismantled life, felt like a mausoleum. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The pain had curdled into a quiet, simmering anger. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for running away without a single word of explanation. But mostly, I was angry at myself for letting him. I had allowed our dynamic to be defined by his needs, his grief, his comfort. I had made myself a passive observer in my own life, waiting for him to make a move, to define the terms. I had let him hold all the power, and he had used it to break my heart. That evening, I drove to his office. I didn't have a plan. I just knew that I could not let it end like this, in a whimper of text messages and unspoken resentments. I needed to face him. I needed to hear it from him, whatever it was. I parked across the street from the sleek, glass and steel building where he worked, and I waited. I watched the employees spill out at the end of the day, a river of suits and laptop bags. Finally, I saw him. He walked out alone, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn and tired. He looked as miserable as I felt. That sight, more than anything, solidified my resolve. I got out of the car and called his name. He stopped, and when he saw me, a look of pure, hunted panic crossed his face. He looked like he was about to turn and run. "Julian," I said again, my voice low but firm, closing the distance between us. "We need to talk, Leo. Now's not a good time," he said, his eyes darting around, as if afraid someone might see us. "I'm really busy." "No," I said, and the quiet finality in my own voice surprised me. "No more excuses. No more running. You owe me a conversation. After everything, you owe me that." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Shame, maybe. He finally gave a small, defeated nod. We ended up in a sterile, soulless coffee shop down the street, the kind of place designed for transient meetings. We sat at a tiny table in the corner, the air between us thick with 3 days of agonizing silence. I was the one who spoke first. "I don't understand," I said, keeping my voice level, fighting to keep the tremor of hurt out of it. "You kissed me, Julian, and then you disappeared. You just left." I deserve to know why. He stared down into his untouched cup of coffee, his fingers tracing the rim. He looked trapped. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I've been a coward. I freaked out. The words were sharper than I intended. "Why? What did you think was going to happen?" He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a desperate, churning conflict. "I don't know, Leo. That's the problem. I don't know what I'm doing. For the past few months, my whole life has been chaos. Everything I thought was solid just turned to dust. And you were the only thing that was real, the only thing that was safe." He took a ragged breath. "I leaned on you. I know that. I took everything you offered because I was drowning, and you were a lifeline, and the kiss." I pressed, my heart hammering. Was that just part of it? Was I just a convenient comfort? The question hung between us, the raw, bleeding heart of my fear. "No," he said, and the word was emphatic, desperate. "God, no. That's what's messing me up so much. It wasn't a mistake. When I kissed you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has felt in a very long time. And that terrifies me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. This is not who I am, Leo. I date women. I was going to marry Sarah. This whole thing with you, it doesn't fit into any of the boxes I've built for my life. I look at you, and I feel things I don't know how to name, and I am scared out of my mind. I'm scared of what it means. I'm scared of what people will think. And most of all, his voice dropped to a whisper. I'm scared of ruining the best friendship I have ever had, and there it was. His fear laid bare. It was not a rejection of me, but a rejection of the unknown. He was terrified of the new landscape that kiss had revealed. He was trying to retreat to the old, familiar map, even if it led him nowhere. A wave of empathy washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of my anger. He was not a coward. He was just lost. And for the first time, I realized that I had to be the anchor not just for his grief, but for his fear as well. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. Julian, I said softly. Look at me. He slowly raised his eyes to mine. Do you think I'm not scared? I have been in love with you for 10 years. For a decade, I have been terrified of you finding out and ruining the exact same friendship. Every single night that you have slept in my bed has been both the best and hardest thing I have ever had to endure. So don't you dare talk to me about being scared. My confession, the one I had guarded for so long, was finally out, spoken into the sterile air of a coffee shop. It felt like shedding a skin I had been wearing for a third of my life. His eyes widened, his expression shifting from fear to pure, unadulterated shock. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. 10 years, he whispered, the words full of a dawning, devastating comprehension. Leo, why didn't you ever say anything? Because of this, I said, gesturing to the space between us, to the mess we were in. Because I was terrified of this exact moment. Of losing you. I would have taken a lifetime of you as my friend over a single day of you as nothing at all. The honesty of it was raw, painful, but liberating. For the first time, there were no more secrets between us. Everything was on the table. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was full. It was the silence of two people finally seeing each other clearly, without the filters of assumption and fear. He was not just the unknowing initiator, and I was not just the quiet observer. We were two people who loved each other, who were terrified of that love, and who had finally, clumsily, crashed into the truth. The resolution did not come in a grand, cinematic moment. It arrived quietly, in the days and weeks that followed our conversation in the coffee shop. It was a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding, of learning a new language together. After that talk, Julian didn't go back to a hotel. He came home with me. But that night, for the first time, when he walked into my bedroom, it was not as a refugee seeking platonic comfort. It was as something else, something new and undefined. He stood by the bed, looking uncertain, and I knew this was a pivotal moment. The old ritual was broken. We had to create a new one. You don't have to, I said softly, giving him an out. You can take the couch, or the spare room. Whatever you need. I was offering him space, but what I was really doing was testing the ground beneath us. Was the foundation we had just laid strong enough to hold us? He looked at me, a long, searching look, and then he gave me a small, hesitant smile. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in days. I don't want the couch, he said. I want to be here, with you. If that's still okay. His question was laced with a vulnerability I had never heard from him before. He was asking for permission, not just to share my bed, but to share my life in this new, terrifying, and beautiful way. It's okay, I said, and my own smile felt like the sun rising after a long night. It's more than okay. That night, when we got into bed, the space between us was not a canyon of unspoken feelings, nor was it a crater of awkwardness. It was an invitation. He rolled onto his side to face me, and I did the same. In the dim light from the hallway, I could see the questions still swimming in his eyes. I reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from his forehead. It was a simple, tender gesture, the kind I had dreamed of making for a decade. He closed his eyes and leaned into my touch, a soft sigh escaping his lips. He didn't kiss me. Instead, he just moved closer until his forehead was resting against mine, and our legs were tangled together under the covers. He took my hand, not in the hesitant way he had on the porch, but with a new, quiet certainty, lacing his fingers through mine. And we fell asleep like that, holding on to each other in the quiet dark, two halves of a whole finally, tentatively, coming together. The following weeks were a study in gentle domesticity. The ambiguity that had been a source of so much anxiety was replaced by a quiet, comforting certainty. The grand, terrifying questions about what this all meant were put aside in favor of small, grounding realities. Julian's toothbrush appeared in the holder next to mine. His clothes started to migrate from the duffel bag in the spare room to the empty drawers in my dresser. He stopped talking about looking for his own apartment. My home, slowly and organically, became our home. We learned to navigate the physical and emotional space between us with a new intentionality. A hand on the small of my back as we passed in the kitchen, a quick kiss on the temple before he left for work, his arm draped over me as we watched a movie on the couch. These were small acts, but they were confirmations, constant, quiet affirmations of the new reality we were building. There were still moments of fear, of uncertainty. One evening, he was unusually quiet, and I felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I found him in the spare room, staring at the boxes of his old life. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, "I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I thought I wanted is in these boxes. And now, I don't want any of it." I came and stood beside him, leaning my shoulder against his. "You don't have to be the person you were," I said. "Maybe you're just becoming the person you were always meant to be." He looked at me, and I could see the gratitude in his eyes. He was not just healing from a breakup anymore. He was undergoing a profound personal recalibration, and he was allowing me to be a witness to it, to be his partner in it. It was a level of intimacy that went far beyond sharing a bed. It was sharing a self. We created new rituals to replace the old one. We started cooking dinner together, a slightly chaotic but joyful dance in my small kitchen. We took long walks on Sunday mornings, my camera back in my hands. But now, when I took photos of him, he would look right at the lens, his smile open and unguarded. There was no more need for stolen moments. Our moments were now shared. The bedroom door, the one that had been left symbolically ajar for so long, was now closed at night. It was no longer an escape route. It was a boundary, protecting the sacred, quiet space we had built together. We were inside, and the rest of the world was out. It was all the security I had ever craved. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Julian moving around the kitchen. I lay in bed for a moment, in the warm patch of sunlight streaming through the window, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. It was a quiet, unassuming happiness, the kind that doesn't shout but hums softly in your bones. I got up and walked into the kitchen. He was standing by the counter, shirtless, wearing a pair of my old sweatpants that hung low on his hips. He turned when he heard me and gave me a lazy, sleep-softened smile. "Morning," he said, holding out a mug of coffee. I took it, and our fingers brushed. That simple touch, once so fraught with meaning and terror, was now just easy and comfortable and ours. I leaned in and kissed him, a slow, morning kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. This is us. This is our life. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The wounds of his past and the long, lonely ache of mine were still there, of course, like faint scars that tell a story. But they were no longer gaping. They were being tended to, with patience and with a quiet, steady love that had been waiting a decade to finally be spoken aloud. We had found our way out of the liminal space of the porch and into the warm, well-lit rooms of a shared life. The key had been turned, the door had been opened, and we had been brave enough, finally, to walk through it together, leaving the ghosts of who we used to be behind in the coming rain.